Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to our final quarterly webinar of the year, or of the academic year, that is. So my name is Michelle C. Blackburn. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at IEL, and I'm really excited to share with you today's topic, using data for effective advocacy. So at our work at IEL, we use data a lot to make sure that we are effectively communicating the work that we're doing, the work that you all are doing, and the impact that it's making on the children, families, and communities that we care deeply about. So I'm excited to share this topic with you today to see how you can use it in your advocacy, and just what your plans are as you begin to integrate data into the everyday work that you are doing. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about what we're our plan for today. All right, so a little bit about IEL and the work that we do. We change systems through people, we build capacity of individuals and teams, and we strengthen the communities and education systems, design tools, leadership development programs that empower people to become catalysts for transformation. So we have a huge footprint, nationally speaking. We work with over 17,000 schools in 370 districts, which means that we have over 11 million students that we work to make sure that we are able to make effective change in their lives. And how do we do it? Technical assistance and professional development, like what you're doing today. Here you're learning about how to use data in your advocacy. We have networks and causes and events and initiatives. And I'm pretty sure if you're on this call, you know that in just 2 weeks, we have our national conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I believe registration is still open. So if you have not yet signed up to attend that conference and still want to do so, you have that chance. And so we can talk about that later today. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to do a quick community builder. We are going to talk about how you can use different types of data in your advocacy. The challenges in using data, it's not always straightforward. Best practices for data-driven policy. How to use data as part of the advocacy cycle. You have the chance to ask some questions to myself or to others if they lift something up that you think is interesting. And then you'll let us know how we did today and how we can improve for the next webinar series. So our goals for today include, I want you to walk out today knowing how to use data in shaping public policy narratives, how you can the practices for collecting and presenting impactful data. You'll be exposed to some real world examples of data-driven advocacy success. So how people have used data to ensure they're able to meet their advocacy goals, and the tools, techniques for communicating data to policymakers and stakeholders. So with that, let's jump into our community builder. My question for you all is, what is one data point or statistic that has resonated with you or inspired you to make a change? And then a follow-up question is, do you know if that statistic or data point is true? And so to get us started with that, I'm going to share an example that has really resonated with me, that is a little dated at this point, and we'll get into that, why that may or may not be a problem if you, and as we get further into this presentation. But one statistic really resonated with me when I used to live in Massachusetts. The the Federal Bank of Boston came up with a statistic saying that in Boston, the average white family had a net worth of $274,000, but the average Black family had a net worth of $8, and kind of went through the rationale as to why historically that has been true and what all the factors that go into that. And that really impacted me understanding it. Moving to Boston, it was very clear to me that there was it was definitely a segregated city in regards to both wealth, economic background, for a lot of reasons. And that really, to me, resonates to me with like different things that impact people's ability to have access to resources, to impact their circumstances. And so that has really, really resonated with me. And that sticks in the back of my mind as something that really inspires me to help do the work that I do. And I know it's true because it came from the Federal Reserve Bank, but there's a lot of statistics that we hear out there that may be impactful, but may not necessarily be true. So one of those might be that credit card statistic that every week people consume a credit card's worth of plastic, that has been pretty debunked pretty well, but still people think about it as a meaningful statistic, a meaningful point of data. So with that, I'm going to divide you all up in everyone. I hope you had good conversations. Does anybody want to share something that they learned from their conversation? Maybe one or two volunteers? Feel free to come off mute.
I can go.
All right, great.
Hi, my name's Jess. I'm the Chief of Continuous Improvement for Replications, Inc. It's a CBO in New York City that does the community school model. Um, we all had very similar data points, but one that stood out to me was that, and I apologize, I don't remember your name, but someone who is in rural Colorado, that it's the most expensive area to raise a family, and that the average family of four to meet the bare minimums in the community needs to make over $100,000. So that was pretty eye-opening.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Rochelle, I see your hand is raised. Feel free to share.
Sure. One of the data points in our group that a gentleman spoke about was in Chicago that the gun violence age is 25 to 35, I believe that's what he said, which debunked what I would have thought, which is exactly what he said. I thought it would have been younger, teenage to mid 20s. I'm complete.
Yeah. All right, thanks for sharing. With that, let's go ahead and jump in to our content for today. So, all right. So, one of the most important things to talk about when we talk about data is understanding what data actually is. And so, I know for some of you, this might, if you've taken statistics or if you do this work on a regular basis, this might seem pretty straightforward. But I do think it's important to just kind of take a step back and talk about the types of data that we use, what that actually means from a policy perspective, and kind of do some level setting to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is data? So there's two types of data that we primarily use in our advocacy. Quantitative, meaning numbers, and qualitative, which is basically information that's not numerical or is the why behind we do something. So quantitative data is typically seen as just descriptive statistics, which might be a percentage, it might be a mean or an average. It's kind of what we think of like traditional statistics that you might see in a report. There's secondary data analysis, which is where you take data from other data sets and work through it. You might do some cross tabulation. There's survey responses that you might go through that are it's more numerical, like a Likert scale rating 1 to 5. This looks like maybe measuring test scores or other academic measures, whereas your qualitative data is information that demonstrates non-numerical why behind a policy, solution, or strategy. So this could be when you have a survey, you have your open-ended, short or long response questions, where people are able to provide more of a narrative behind a prompt. This is your focus group information or interviews that you might do, a literature review where you understand, you go through the research that's been done on a topic. That's can be qualitative data, document analysis, or even going through and doing a site visit and talking about your experiences that you've had there. And I think also one thing that we don't tap into enough are case studies. So that can be some qualitative data of really understanding, going through, analyzing something that's happened, understanding what might be the motivations behind it, what could be different outcomes. So those are kind of what we talk about quantitative and qualitative data. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you have questions about that, please prop them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them for you when we get to the Q&A. But those are the types of data we'll be talking about. So why do we use data? Data is evidence. We use evidence all the time. It's not something's not true because I say it's so. It's true because a lot of people have said it's so, and I have the numbers and the stories to prove it. So when it comes to quantitative data, analysts and advocates use quantitative data to demonstrate effectiveness, predict trends, identify gaps, and identify correlation. So we'll talk about correlation and causation later. But this is when I do a one pager and I say, there's for every $1 invested in community schools, there's a $15 return on investment. That's a quantitative data point. But then I might get into the qualitative data point, which I might say what that looks like is we have more teachers in the classroom that can make more impacts on more students. That might look like we have we're able to invest more in school lunches, we're able to invest more in partnerships. So it's complex in the way that we utilize data. For qualitative data, we're able to convey people's experience, use real world impacts and information that cannot be correctly expressed as a number. So that might be the emotional impact that something may have, and maybe the community impacts doesn't necessarily translate well into a numerical setting, but maybe is able to be conveyed more through a story. Qualitative data, what that looks like as evidence, might be a testimony. It might be a Hill meeting. It might be a quote that you have for somebody that doesn't necessarily translate into a percentage, but really carries a lot of emotional weight and can convey the impact of something that may not be able to be expressed in numbers. So there are challenges in using data. One of those is validating data sources. So you want to make sure that the information that you're using comes from a reputable source. It's usually a peer-reviewed source, and that source itself cites its sources. So I know that's a little meta, but you really want to make sure that people are doing their due diligence, using the correct information, that the information is objective. So read the fine print. Who's funding the research? What is the sample size and population that they're utilizing? So earlier I mentioned the credit card statistic that humans every week consume up to 5 grams, which is equivalent of 1 credit card worth of plastic. That was funded by that research was funded by an organization that was specifically looking to minimize plastic waste in oceans. And so also the population they used were populations where forever chemicals are more commonly, or humans are more commonly exposed to forever chemicals because they're adjacent to landfills. So it was a very specific study looking for a very specific answer using a very specific population, and then it was extrapolated to all people are exposed to this much credit card waste or this much plastic waste in an average week. So you see how not necessarily doing the due diligence, digging just a little bit deeper into that indicates what might actually be what's actually telling the story behind the statistic, behind this data. We try to encourage you to use primary sources as much as possible. So direct research, you're not necessarily hearing it secondhand, but you are hearing it directly from the people who you're impacting or who may be impacted by a policy or who you're trying to create policy solutions for. You want to ensure that the data is relevant to your issue or community, and you want to use timely data. So historically, within social sciences, we usually say between about 10 years out is good data. But when we're talking about policy, we really want to be within a 2-year time frame, which can be challenging from time to time, and we'll get into that a little bit. But we really want to make sure that it's as current as possible. So about 2 years out. Another challenge in using data is that there's bias involved. And so that some of that might be your own biases, and some of that also might be the biases of the people who are producing the data. So you want to understand what your biases and assumptions are when collecting or determining which data to use. So really take the time to use data that to really evaluate whether or not the data that you're utilizing really aligns with your policy solution or recommendations. We all have biases, and it's important to be aware of them. And this is true for the person that you're advocating to as well. So really recognize that you might be meeting with somebody who has a very specific perspective on what you're trying to talk to them about, or maybe they know nothing at all, and you really have the opportunity to influence them. But recognize that biases do play a role on the way that we use data. And this can lend itself to confirmation bias. So you don't want to cherry pick the data that sounds really, really good, but it's taken out of context, but it really supports what you're trying to promote. That can be really, really challenging. So make sure that you're really taking your time to evaluate whether or not the data actually says what you're trying to convey that it says, and is still valid. You want to make sure that you avoid outliers of proof points. And this is really easy to do with qualitative data. So, we've all had a situation where it's like, well, people say, everyone is saying this, and it's really just that person and their small group of friends. And I think that they are speaking on behalf of a larger group, when in reality, it's a very small group of people who feel a certain way. And we can also let personal experience serve as a data point or a starting point. And this can be really tricky, specifically when it comes to policy advocacy. And when I worked in higher education, this was always a challenge. But people think about their own experience, whether in K through 12, with their own learning experience or their children's experience, or their own experience in higher education. Saying, I've been through school, I've been through college, that therefore that makes me an expert in education policy. And that's not necessarily true. That just because what your experience was 15, 20, 30, sometimes 50 years ago, doesn't necessarily stand true today. So really making sure that people understand, rather you really understand that everyone has a bias when you're coming in to advocate and make sure that the data that you have is as bias-free as possible and is as valid as possible. Which also gets us to the point of talking about lying with statistics, which we've all heard of. And sometimes it can be a little intentional and sometimes it's really unintentional. So here with this graph, I have two graphics here. So we'll look at the average female height per county. And so if you look at this, you see that the scale is skewed to provide a different representation of results. So really, the scale here, it doesn't even start at 0, technically. It starts at 5 feet tall. And there's really only a 1-inch difference between this, but it makes it look like women from Latvia are giants and women from India are little people. And so really making sure that the representation, the data that you're looking at is accurately represented, whether it's graphical representation or the way that it's presented a different way, like this infographic here. This is from the U.S. Department of Education. We see that it shows that really there's only a 7 percentage points between 2007 and 2013, but it looks like this incredible increase over time. But it really isn't. It's only 7 percentage points over the course of what, 7 years? And so that's only a 1 point percentage increase every year. So is it intentional? No. Is it misleading? Probably. So really being careful in the way that you present data, infographics, whatnot, to make sure that you're being honest and upfront with the way that the data is being presented. One thing I did want to note is that correlation does not mean causation. I know there's a lot of conversation about this, especially in the social sciences, but just because there is a relationship between two data points does not necessarily mean that one is impacting or causing the other. So really being sure that, just because I can't think of something off the top of my head, unfortunately, but just because something might be true in one circumstance does not make it universally true or does not directly lead to a specific outcome. Sample sizes and demographics are also really, really important. So when you're reading a study, when you're using something as an example, make sure that it's accurately representing the population that you're trying to represent or to speak to. We see this a lot in different medical studies, for example. There might be studies saying, it's healthy to drink wine. And then 2 weeks later, there's another study that comes out. It's like, actually, even 1 drop of alcohol could cause irrevocable damage on your body. And you scratch your head, you're like, these two things don't make sense. And so that goes back to sample size and demographics. So one study might be related to a very specific population. It might be, only looking at one specific gender, whereas the other study might be looking at a different geographic region with people with different ancestry, a different gender. And so really understanding what's behind those can be really, really important to understand the impacts and outcomes of data. One of the things that can be really tricky, especially when we're talking about survey data, is asking leading questions. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily intend to do this, but they might ask a question instead of saying, tell me whether or not you agree with this statement versus, do you agree that this statement is true? And so those might necessarily yield different responses, indicating that the person who wrote the survey might want you to agree or disagree that this prompt is true or false, versus just tell me how you feel about this response, whether or not you believe it's true or false. So those are ways that you can craft a survey question, it's good to ask somebody to take a look if you're doing a survey. Is this a leading question? Am I trying to write the question a certain way to solicit a specific response? It's always good to get another set of eyes. And then another thing I wanted to note is sometimes people change benchmarks or metrics to indicate a greater impact, even though the data is the same. So this might look like, oh, we had greater test results in this year. Look at the increase of students who performed better on this test versus last year. Well, the percentage might actually be the same in regards to increase in performance, but they just lowered the metric of what is a passing score, for example. So what may have been 75%, they lowered it to 65%. So even though the test results may be the same year over year, the statistics say, oh, more students pass because all they did was just lower the metric for what is passing versus not passing. So that's another way that people lie with statistics. So we've talked about challenges with using data. Let's talk about best practices with using data. So when you're working in an advocacy setting, you really want to make sure that you've researched all your targets, all the people that you're trying to advocate to. So do your homework. Don't only know your data, but know about the data of the person you're trying to advocate to. So for example, if I have a Hill meeting with a member of Congress, one of the first things I do when I schedule that Hill meeting is I go and I research that member's district or their state if they're a senator. So I know about the percentages of the schools within their district that are Title I schools. I know about the demographics of that school. I know the stance on their various issues when it comes to education policy. And that helps me better understand what data I can craft that might be better used as an inflection point to make a connection with them, or maybe more effective in my ability to advocate to them to be interested in community schools or family and community engagement or youth mentorship programs, et cetera, et cetera. So I know my data. I know I have a roster of different facts that I can use depending upon who I'm talking to. I have qualitative and quantitative data. That way, as the conversation goes, I have statistics I can pull out. I have a story that I can talk about. Maybe I bring somebody in with me to that Hill meeting that can tell their story as a primary source, like we talked about earlier, that can share their testimony about what is happening in the field or in their classroom. So we're able to really have a lot of different data sets to pull from to really influence and change the way that we tell our story. We want to use current data, like I said. You want to make sure that you update your data on a regular basis, aim for a 2-year window. Which can be difficult because it can take time, especially when we're doing academic data or education data. And it might be almost the end of the current academic year before the previous academic year's data is fully assessed. So that can be really challenging at times. So I always, say this is the most, even if it's from the 2022-2023 school year, I'll say this is the most up-to-date data that we have on this. We're awaiting the 23-24 academic data. I'll get that to you as soon as I can. And then one thing that can be a little bit challenging is that pre-COVID data may no longer be relevant. The farther we get out from COVID, it gets a little bit easier because the data is updated. But what may be true in a post-COVID world may not be true or what may have been true in a pre-COVID world may not be true in a post-COVID world. So be really mindful of the data that you're using. That make sure that it's probably from 2022 and beyond, as opposed to 2022 and afterwards or before that. And then another thing, especially when we're dealing with education data, you want to make sure that you're getting permission to use stories or data, including using data disclosure statements in any survey or assessment tools that you utilize. So saying by completing this survey, you're agreeing that we might use this information. We may contact you to see if we could use this in maybe a brochure or a report. Whenever you're having people share their testimony, whether it's in a Hill meeting or writing something to go before a policymaking board, make sure that it's in their voice and they're able to tell their story on their terms. We really want to make sure that people are able to advocate and use their own words. You don't want to do that for them. And some people may not be comfortable sharing their information for whatever reason. So make sure that you do get permission to use people's information, whether anonymized or not. And if there are questions, I'm also, when we get to the Q&A, I know there's some people might be thinking, but FERPA says we can't share information. You can for research purposes. I actually happen to be a FERPA person. So if you have questions about that, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A section. So one other thing I wanted to note, there we go. And best practices are different tools that you can use to collect and disseminate data. So one of the things that we use at IEL is we use a tool called Alchemer. But there's also, if you don't have resources to pay for a survey platform, Google Forms are really great. Pretty straightforward. I'm sure probably everyone on this call has used a Google form. There's also SurveyMonkey that you can do a free version of that. When you're doing secondary data analysis, the US Census is really, really good for information. So it may take a little bit to familiarize yourself with those data sets, but the US Census is a really good tool. And the National Center for Education Statistics still exists. That also has really, really good data that you can utilize. If you're trying to do data visualizations, such as making graphs, infographics, etc., Tableau, Excel, and Canva. I know Canva is the new hotness. Everyone loves to use Canva. It can be a really, really great tool. And then if you want to do geographic information systems, this QDIS is also really, really good too if you're trying to better understand geographic regions and things that might impact why certain things are the way that they are. So if you're looking at a rural school, like maybe the geographic landscape actually has significant impacts on the way those students perform or whatnot. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is data and the advocacy cycle. So one of the things that we're really mindful of at IEL and the work that we do with different coalitions is that the work is never done. Even if you get the bill passed that you want to get passed, the program is up and running, it's wonderful. There's always ways to iterate on it. There's always new members in Congress or in your state assembly or state legislature. There's always new city councilors and school board leaders. And so you want to make sure that you're always work in that advocacy. So as new people come on board, they need to learn about the work that you're doing. You need to build those relationships. You might have had a really robust relationship with somebody, and then as you start to work on a project, you need to come back and revisit that relationship and rebuild that relationship with their new staff. Maybe the bill that you implemented is wonderful, but there's some tweaks, there's some little hiccups that you need to work through. And so you need to evaluate those. So we're always iterating, we're always advocating, even when we accomplish our big goals. And so the way that we use data, if you notice on this graph, it's in 4 different places. So we use data to identify policy problems and to identify policy solutions. So data comes into play there. When we educate policymakers, whether that is through meetings or one-pagers or social media toolkits, we are using data to educate those members using the qualitative and quantitative data. As we influence people, as they write dear colleague letters, and as you do your advocacy campaigns and you influence people to align with your policy solution, you use data to do that. You could even use data like, we've got this many members who are on board. Are you on board too? So always updating your data, always using data on your advocacy. We implement it, and then we use data to evaluate it. So is it going the way that we planned? Are we getting the results that we had hoped for? Are people picking up on what we have tried to accomplish on this with this policy goal? Is this pilot study going the way that we had hoped so? If not, let's go back and identify the policies and gaps and create new policy solutions. Maybe something needs to be reauthorized. So we use data and the advocacy to get a bill reauthorized. So we're constantly using data in this advocacy cycle, and we're constantly updating the data as we move through that data cycle. And here are some examples of data in action. So the Piedmont City Schools, they use personalized learning through data. So during the pandemic, while many schools faced declines in math performance, Piedmont City schools and rural Alabama achieved significant improvements. The six participating uh, schools. Oh, excuse me, that's a different point. So they really were able to use data to really identify ways that they could impact student performance and use that data to really custom tailor results. So they were able to increase their performance scores by the end of the spring 2022. They were ranked 12th in the state in math proficiency. So able to make a lot of improvements, just taking the time to use the data to really understand how they can improve student performance. And then the JPAL lab at MIT, what they were able to do was to take randomized controlled trials to demonstrate significant improvements on literacy and numeracy. And they grouped students by learning level rather than age. So they really took the data and understood where the students were and grouped them in proficiency as opposed to just this is the grade that they're in. And in doing so, they were able to impact and increase students' performances based upon being working with their peers as opposed to just working within their grade level. And so the findings led to the program's expansion across India and to several African countries, impacting over 4 million children and influencing national education strategies. So they really were able to use the data to prove that maybe this might be a better way to go through and teach students where they're at, as opposed to having metrics that they're expected to meet. We can rather flip the script on these students and really say, okay, this is where you're at. Let's use the data to move you forward to get to where you need to be. And then the last one, this is really, really interesting. And I think this is I'd like to do a case study on this. The Connecting People and Place project. So the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which took place in 2013, they launched a 3-year project to increase access to information and integrated data systems for local policy, so that foundations and community-based organizations use the data to address local issues. So, for example, the 6 participating partners were able to design site-specific projects on a wide range of policy issues, including chronic absenteeism. And so they were able to really dig into the data and see, okay, how can we use data as both a policy driver and a solution to impact this issue of chronic absenteeism within our district. So really, really understanding how data can be a powerful tool, both in advocacy and evidence-driven solution. And then just a little bit of a point that I wanted to note when it comes to full service community schools. So in 2008, we had the first federal appropriation for full service community schools. And then we did a lot of work utilizing data every step of the way to indicate how full service community schools is a data-driven, evidence-based solution to really impact students' lives. And so one of the things I do want to highlight is that we were able to, over multiple administrations, through the President Obama, through President Trump, through President Biden, and then hopefully again through President Trump, we're able to increase funding year over year for full service community schools. So you'll see right here that we were able to get in 2022, we're able to get an increase, 150% increase for full service community schools. And that had a lot to do with just making sure that we're able to tell the story of community schools through data. So really talking about getting into the granular data about what are individual schools doing, how is community schools driving academic performance, chronic absence, whole student development, whole child development, teacher retention, like really using that as a way by which we could communicate the efficacy of this model. And so that's really something that we wanted to highlight, that we were able to, across every single administration over the past 15 years, really increasing the evidence of full service community schools. And then the last thing I wanted to do was really just some ways you can share data and advocacy. So we typically think about just descriptive statistics, percentages, what are things that we can show mathematically that has a number behind it of levels of improvement. But I really want you to think kind of outside the box. So we use words, images, or videos. So you can have a graphical representation. You could also, have a video testimony. There's ways that you can convey data beyond just a fact sheet. You can have collateral. I always recommend this. And so, whether you have an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting, have a one-pager or report on hand to leave with stakeholders or policymakers. That typically is more of a fact sheet that just has the bullet points of the evidence of the efficacy of your program or your policy solution. But it could also be an infographic, so it's a little easier to digest, a little more pleasing to the eye. We at IEL, we do an annual progress report on full service community school grant recipients. So I have a report of just showing like how things are going, ways that they're making improvements, how the money that's for these programs is being well spent. And so I have that collateral as well. And then I always say, use data whenever communicating with policymakers or stakeholders. So one of the things that we do in our sign-on letters is we provide the evidence, we provide information, the data on why this program is working and why they need to continue to support it. When we draft bills, if you look at the proclamations, at the resolutions that we put before Congress in support of full service community schools, there's always a preamble or an evidence section that talks about the efficacy of the model and how data proves that this program works. We use it in meetings and testimonies, and even in call-in or writing campaigns. Some of you may have been contacted by us to ask Congress to tell them why they need to continue to fund the full service community school program. And a part of that is including the data as to why this program is really, really important. And a lot of that is just your own qualitative data, your own story, your student stories, your family stories, your community stories as to why this is really, really important and why they need to continue funding full service community schools. So with that, questions. I noticed while I was speaking, there are some things that popped off in the chat. So give me just 1 second to look through the chat to see if there's any questions. And if not, feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes, the correlation of every time I eat ice cream, it rains. Yes, that's there may be a correlation there. I don't think that's causation. So that's a really good example of correlation versus causation. All right, any questions that people have for us, or anything that you want to lift up or talk about, or any examples of the way that you've used data? I see Elle asked a question: what are the most common ways in which people unwittingly generate or interpret data in ways that is misleading? Ooh, that's a really good question. I think when it comes to interpreting data, I think one of two things can happen. People hear a snippet, a soundbite, they read a headline, and they don't necessarily dig into what is actually behind that statistic, that piece of data. So maybe not necessarily, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, but not necessarily doing their due diligence of really understanding what the data says. Or two, just not necessarily understanding the data itself, maybe not necessarily understanding methodology, how that data came to be, understanding the study, understanding, like I said earlier, the sample group that they utilize to create that statistic. And so again, I don't think it's people, I think it's just people don't either have the time or they don't necessarily understand. I mean, I read a lot of studies that I'm just like, I don't get it. I do not understand this, and I have to read a couple of times. And I just have to say like, okay, I don't know what this actually is trying to convey to me. So I think that's some ways that people unwittingly generate or interpret data, but just not really understanding the story behind that data, how it got there. All right, I think I saw a hand earlier. Was it Anika? Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just saying the importance of advocacy. That's just something that I love to do. And it's always good when you can build those rapport with the same individuals, because a lot of times when they see you, they'll answer your questions if you're in a group of folks, or they may support whatever you may be presenting in a sense. Sometimes, but sometimes
Yeah.
they can be the one to get the other assembly members or senators to kind of buy in a little bit too. So you know, those are always good. And the one pagers are always good because you never want to have too much, but you want to have the key information. And if you feel like something is missing, just state. I did my own deep dive and this was missing because we know, I was just typing in the chat that we know there's implicit bias. There's things that are intentionally left out sometimes, or sometimes folks just don't do their homework or don't know where to go. So they just say, oh, this is all we have. And that's what they present. And you know, it may be incorrect. So
Yeah, yeah, actually, and thank you for lifting that up about, sometimes there's just too much data, there's just too much information to convey. And so it's important when you're going through your data roster to really pull out the data points that have the most impact, have the most bang for their buck, if you will. So kind of one of the things that I do in my own work is I ask my spouse to listen to my pitch, to my spiel. He knows nothing about education policy. He's a software engineer. So he can really help me make sure that I'm using language that makes sense, that I'm using statistics and information that is powerful. So that if I'm coming to somebody who doesn't know anything about community schools or education policy, they understand what I'm talking about without me having to give them a primer on what does all this jargon mean and what is this and what is that they are able as a layperson to understand what I'm trying to convey to them. So Anika, that's a really good point. Thanks for lifting that up about being really strategic with the information that you share. Mark Anthony asked, what do you use to make your data look pretty? If you want to use graphical information, I actually do recommend Canva. I think that can be really, really impactful. But one of the things that I think is really important is if you are doing like a fact sheet and you're just doing bullet points, make it as clear as possible. Just similar to like a resume, you want to make it really so that someone who's just looking at it, if they have 30 seconds to look at this fact sheet, you can effectively communicate the information in a clear and concise way and they get it. If you try to couch it with too much qualifiers or too much context, that can be really, really difficult. So just use really concise language, really clear bullet points. And one of the things that I do when I do digital fact sheets is I just link to my sources, right? Instead of having to cite my sources, that's the way I do it. I just do a hyperlink. So if somebody wants to dig a little deeper and look at my work, they can just click on that hyperlink and they can see where that information is coming from. Right, I'm looking at the chat for more questions. Caitlin asks, how to use data to figure out the policies impacting the data? Caitlin, would you mind coming off of mute to kind of clarify your question? Maybe give me a little bit more context behind your question.
Yeah, sorry, this is like super specific. I'm working with two different groups that are a youth and family advisory group. So
Caitlin, we can barely hear you. Can you maybe get a little bit closer to your mic?
Yeah, is that better?
Oh, thank you.
So
Yeah,
sorry.
much better. Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
I'm wearing a weird headphone thing that I don't
Yeah.
understand. Sorry. So this is just super specific, so it's okay if it's not relevant for this group, but I'm working with a group of students and families looking at data in our community in Colorado. It's a Healthy Kids Colorado survey and different data sets to really try to understand, when it comes to advocacy and policy change, understanding the data and what policies are in place that might affect what we see in that data. And so just trying to understand more about like what resource wise or what you've seen to be able to link like, okay, if we're seeing that, 3 out of 5 students of color are treated differently in the discipline process at their school than Anglo students, like what is the policy within that school? How do you follow it up the ladder to really figure out what is determining why we're seeing those data sets?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what you're describing is doing that data analysis piece. And so I think my answer to that question is like doing the homework, like really understanding, is there a correlation between schools' disciplinary policies and the way that they're impacting different students? And really looking at that data set specifically, and then also doing a literature review on what does the research say on discipline policies in schools and how they impact different demographics of students. And so there's actually a great body of literature on this. And so really like doing that literature review, understanding, is this a one-off? Is there a through line with this? Is there significantly significant data indicating that this is a trend? Is there more qualitative data behind this versus quantitative data to indicate that there might be a through line? So really like doing that actual research. What you're asking is like an actual research project to really do that homework. But can also, it's worth it, right? If that's the policy solution you're trying to implement, that extra work can be really, really impactful in the advocacy that you're doing to indicate like this is a real problem. This is what the research says. This is what the data says. This isn't a one-off, and this is what we need to do to correct it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then I saw another question in the chat, and we'll have time for maybe one or two. Do you think a method to protect integrity of presented data might be organizations collaborating on the findings? I would say probably not actually. That the integrity of the data really comes with how you share the data, not necessarily the collaboration. And maybe I'm misreading or misunderstanding that question. But I think the people who collect that data are the ones who are responsible for maintaining the integrity of that data, and that really has to do with the way the data is shared, whether that is privacy and making sure that the information is anonymized, whether it has to do with the physical way the information is shared. If it's a Google spreadsheet, if that data is locked, people have editing access to make sure that that data can't be changed. I think that the validity of the research can be improved by collaborating. The ability to collect the data can be improved by collaborating. But I think that to protect the integrity really has to do with your methodology and the way that you're sharing said data. Robin, I hope that answered your question and didn't confuse it even more. Anybody want to come off mute and ask one more question? Or share a best practice that they have? All right, with that, I saw a question in the chat was, are we going to get the deck? The answer is yes, we will send you the deck. We're also going to send you an evaluation link that we just want to know. It's a quick five question qualitative survey, or excuse me, quantitative survey, to just let us know how we did. Ways we can improve this for the next time we do our quarterly webinar series. To really how we can impact the work that you're doing. Our goal here is to help you. And so help us help you by filling out our 5-question survey. It should take 2 minutes or less. So with that, I'll give you back 5 minutes of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. You will get the deck. You will get that link to that survey. And we hope to see you all in Minneapolis in 2 weeks. I'm happy to hang on the line if people have specific questions they want to ask in the next few minutes. But with that, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi.
I'm sorry I joined late. For some
Oh, it's
reason, the
okay.
alarm went off differently. I was just tuning in. This is about data collection and data distribution. We're currently trying to track attendance. Truancy is a big issue in the majority of the schools that we work with. And I was wondering if you had any advice or tools to help maybe survey families in regards to what barriers may be preventing them from being in perfect attendance and things of that nature.
Yeah, great question. And I would say for anybody who's still on the call, that what I'm about to say is pretty universal, that I think this is best practice for any type of data that you're trying to collect. I would say make it easy, whatever methodology you're using to collect the data, whether that is a survey, whether that is, you're just like a questionnaire, like just grabbing people as they pick up their kid from school, saying like, hey, can I ask you a question for a minute? Whatever you think is most likely one that people are going to respond well to. and two, that you're going to think you're going to get the data that you need. So we've all been at the grocery store and there's people out there like, hey, can I ask you a quick question? You're like, no, I just want to get my groceries. So like, please leave me alone. So, that might not be the best way to do it, but maybe it's at a PTA meeting, right? Or maybe it is at the front office, or maybe it's you send an email out to people and you have them do a quick survey that takes 2 minutes, right? It's not laborious. We've all taken surveys where it's like, oh my gosh, it's been 20 minutes. I'm still taking this thing. Like, please leave me alone. So like really being mindful of what that, not to sound like businessy, but like what that user experience is going to be like, because the harder it is for people to take a survey, the less quality data that you're going to have. So be really, really mindful in how you're doing that. I've even seen surveys, where it's like, if you liked this experience, like drop a green piece of paper on the bucket when you leave. If you didn't like it, drop a red piece of paper in the bucket. Like that is qualitative data or quantitative data, right? That is collecting information. So think about different ways beyond just a survey, how you might collect that information. The other thing is you want to make sure that when you collect that information, that people feel safe. So for example, if you're using vulnerable populations, if you're using with mixed status families, people might be really, really reticent to provide you information about their families. So why is your child truant? They may not feel safe providing that information for you. So you want to make sure that whether it is anonymized, whether that you can promise that the information isn't going to be used for their family, that you're just trying to collect, aggregate data, however you want to convey, you want to make sure that people understand that the information, the purposes that you're going to be using it for, and that they feel safe in collecting that and providing that data for you. Did that answer your question? Or are you looking for something more granular?
Oh, no, that's great.
Okay.
That keeps us moving in a real good direction with the surveys that we've been using and the way we frame those questions and how we put that information out. So I appreciate
Yeah. And be mindful too. I mean, you might, asking a parent might be a different result than asking a student, not to like be too controversial, but like you might get different responses depending upon the population that you ask or the survey group that you ask, right? So also be thinking about that too. Like who's the right person to be asking this question to? If you're asking high school students versus elementary school students, you're probably going to get different results. So there's a factor as well to consider.
That's great.
Michelle, I was
Thank you.
gonna say, include like, think about the cultural, and then also if a lot of times parents put on the application if they're receiving SNAP benefits, if they have HEAP, those things may bring you a little more information in a sense, but you don't want to also be biased in that because just because you're receiving those, that could just be in addition, not a full need. But think of that, and when you say the data, like where's the data going? Because a lot of parents would be like, why do you need this information? Where's it going? And definitely, is it anonymous? Because that makes a difference. Do I have to put my name on it? Or and are you reporting this somewhere? Because depending on the trauma or lived experiences of some families, they may be worried that may go to another agency or somewhere else.
Yeah. And like only collect the data that you need. If you don't need emails, don't ask for emails. If you don't need addresses, don't ask for addresses. If you're just collecting that data just to have it, depending upon the purposes of your survey or the information you're collecting, you may not need to ask that question. So is it good information to have? Sure. Is it going to impact your ability to collect that information? Potentially. So be mindful about that too. And I did just want to note on the chat, it says that, and you might need to change your questions depending upon the audience. I would be careful about that because that will change your results. If you ask a question in a different way, you might get a different result than what you anticipate. And so I would try to design questions that are fairly universal no matter what your audience, because if you change the question for your audience, that's going to get different results, which is going to skew your results, and you may not get accurate data. So just be mindful of that. I understand the spirit behind that, but just from a pure research perspective, that's not a good practice.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other last minute questions before we jump off? All right. Well, I appreciate you all being willing to hang out with me a little bit longer. You can always reach out to me or anyone else in the policy team if you have questions about how to utilize data or how to convey data in a meaningful way. I'll just drop that in the chat real quick. which is policy@iel.org. And you'll also receive our email address, or you receive from this email address the slide deck. So you'll see it later today. So, all right, with that, thank you for joining me today. I hope yeah, Anika, you had a question?
Quick question. Will we be put on a mailing list by any chance for whenever you're having, or your agency is having any more of these webinars, or do we just have to go onto the website and sign up whenever we see something?
This information is provided to if you're signed up to any of IEL's newsletters or monthly policy updates or whatnot, which is I'm guessing how you found about this first place. You're good to go. You don't need to be on any other mailing list. We've got you on our mailing list. So yeah, you should be getting all the correspondence about these. But this is our last for this fiscal year. This is our last webinar because we're in our last quarter. But we'll start again in the fall with our quarterly webinars. All right. Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today. I enjoyed it talking with all of you. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day.